Going on. Hey, I'm excited you're here this morning. When you came in, you got something that looked like this, did you not? Let me tell you what we're excited about. Today is our 1-year birthday. Yes, so this is the year, a year ago. Hold on, everybody. Man, I love it. You know, last week you guys were clapping a lot more. I love it. I love the energy. But you can't have something as big as a birthday, right? When we went from portable to permanent, and God blessed us with this kind of as a base of operation, we can't celebrate that without making noise. God does something good in your life. You want to share it. So we're going to share it a little bit in here. So on the count of 3, everybody's got your little noisemaker. Hold on just a second. I feel like noisemakers aren't the best we can do. I feel like we can do more than that. But on the count of 3, so you just follow my lead here. We'll see what happens. On the count of 3, you're going to blow real loud on this little horn. Ready? 1, 2, 3. I had no idea what that was going to do. I've seen these things go terribly wrong on television. But anyway, hey, I hope, if you're a guest, we're glad you're here. We are celebrating, I'm going to set this down. We are celebrating this first anniversary because I do think God has some big things in store for us. So, one, take the noisemaker home with you this week. That is something you can drive. Hey, put it in your car. Just celebrate all week. Like drive around, you stopped at stoplights, take it out, just blow on that thing. People are going to think you're crazy, but you got something to celebrate. In a little bit when we leave too, go out the door, turn to the right, and over here in the corner, we got a birthday cake. So get some birthday cake as we keep celebrating. If you're a guest, again, and you're not a regular around here, or you're just becoming a regular, we're in a series we've called Next. And basically we're asking the question of God, okay, so we're a year old, we went from portable to permanent. But what does that mean? We don't believe the building is the end of what God has for us. He didn't bring us along just so we could have a building, right? That this is actually the beginning of the ministry God wants to do in this community, in our lives, and in the lives of our friends and neighbors that are all over the place. So in this next series, we're asking the question, like the sign says, what is next? What does God have for us? What does He want for us? Not just to, have a group, have an organization, have a building, but what does He want to do in and through us? And this is not meant to be one of those things where we force anything upon anybody, right? We're just asking the question, what is next? Now, ultimately, this whole series ends next Sunday. So don't miss next Sunday. Next Sunday is Commitment Sunday. This series involves a money piece to it. It's a capital initiative. We're asking people to sacrificially commit to the next 2 years to give above and beyond what maybe you give on a regular basis. If you don't give anything on a regular basis, maybe you're taking the first step with Journey for the first time. We welcome that. We're excited about that. But if you're not a regular, just sit there, relax, okay? This series is not for you as much as it will be in the future. We hope that you stay with us. But if you're a regular, we're asking that question, what does it look like to live into this space that you've given us, to live into the future of Journey and what God is calling us to? And so that is why we've been talking about this for so many weeks. Now, I'm going to keep saying this because I know some of you. I know some of you that you've been hurt by churches. You've been hurt by money. You've been hurt by the whole conversation. And the bottom line is this. There's nothing compulsory about this initiative. This is a completely a voluntary thing. This is God inviting you to consider a next step, right? I keep telling you, God's people have God's money to do God's work. And if that's the case, then all we have to do is show up and be obedient. Everybody in here just asks the question, what does God want from me? Listen, pray, and act. Just be available, right? We're not strong-arming. That's not our way. We don't think it's a biblical way. We don't guilt anybody. Right? We're not asking for you to sign up and then we're gonna show up at your doorstep if you miss a payment somewhere. We don't do business like that, right? Why? Because it's just about our obedience. It's not about your funds as much as it is about your faith and you growing up. So as we've been doing this, guys, what have we been talking about? These principles that we can pull out of the scriptures because of this. Because we know that Jesus talked about money almost more than any other topic. In fact, He talked about it more than He talked about loving others. He talked about it more than He talked about heaven and hell. He talked about it because it was impressed upon others that it was so important. Why? We keep going back to this idea that your money, your possessions are the primary competitor for most of us for God's affection in this life. It's a primary, I said that wrong. Money is a primary competitor for your heart in this world, to pull our affections from God. Now, to believe that, to live into that, here's where we had to come from. We really came to the first conclusion that everything belongs to God anyway. But whether you believe that or not, you have to at least agree that money is a primary competitor in all of our lives. It doesn't matter your faith. Money is pulling on us all the time. We live in an area where, I mean, my son sent me a picture the other day. There was a Ferrari pulling out of my neighborhood. Okay, my neighborhood is not a Ferrari neighborhood. But money is such a tug, right? And if you like nice cars, my son and I we drool over that kind of thing. Like, that's really cool to us, right? Why? Because money and stuff is a primary competitor. And we believe it's that place in our lives because everything does belong to God. If you're not convinced that everything belongs to God, you at least understand the pool of money and resources. And hopefully you're beginning to understand something we talked about last week, that money doesn't make a great end, right? Money is a great means to an end. Money can do great things in your life and propel the ministry of God and propel great things for people around you. But money is not a great end to life, right? Because you've never seen somebody driving down the road with a hearse and a big old U-Haul behind them taking all their stuff. The last time we saw that was, what, 2,000 years ago? And the Egyptians built pyramids and they filled it with all the stuff that people wanted to take with them into the afterlife. And what happens? 2,000 years later, we go crack open some of those tombs and all that stuff is still there. It doesn't get to go with you, right? So we talked about steward our actions in a way that we can achieve something with our end, that we have our eyes set on a different end than the rest of the world. So that's where we come from. We've talked about surrender, we've talked about stewarding, and today I want to cross the line and make you really uncomfortable, and we're going to talk about sacrifice. So if you'll walk with me for just a second, I'll try to make this as simple as I can. When I mention the phrase sacrifice, most of you, if you're like me, you think of one thing. Now, you probably don't think about the same thing I think about, but you think about a really big act, right? You think about something that might be like a battlefield-worthy act. The idea of sacrifice is giving up something, and we have this image in our head of it being like a giving up my life on the battlefield. I think about sacrifice in ways that you probably don't. I think about John McClane in Die Hard, right? Still nobody sees this show. Listen, this is a great show. You people have got to watch this movie. Die Hard, John McClane. I think about this guy that sacrifices himself. He's bleeding and bloody and beat up by the end of the show. Why? To help save some people. I think like that when it comes to the idea of sacrifice. But there's a concept we need to wrestle with. I think like that in some ways because of a verse that Jesus said, a passage from John, where Jesus made this statement. Now, if you're not a Christian or you haven't studied the Bible much, I guarantee you've heard this verse because it's out there even in the world around us. Jesus made this comment. He said, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. See, that's kind of where we get this sacrificial, laying down, battlefield-worthy type of experience. I think there's nothing wrong with that. But I think if you think only about the big act, you're missing something. I think you're missing something. On April 8th, back in 1968, my dad had a buddy in Vietnam. They were friends, Captain Max Cleland. Bring up his picture if you've got it from the early days. Yeah, my dad didn't know I had that this morning. That's a picture that I found online from this guy. Max Cleland was a captain in the Army, and he had been sent up on a hill to set up some radio relay station. And in the process, he took two guys who were under his authority with him, under his command, and they jumped out of the helicopter up on a hill. And as they were taking place and getting ready for the helicopter to leave, you know, you kind of have to duck so the rotors don't hit you. He noticed a grenade on the ground. And instinctually, he picked it up to clear the area. If you'll give me the next picture, Max lost both legs and one arm that day. And it radically changed his life, right? He offered this sacrifice of his body on the battlefield. And the interesting thing is, Max would never really talk about it, and still doesn't to this day, as a sacrifice. In fact, Max went on to be a state rep for the state of Georgia. He's been in politics, and back in '97, the Boston Globe was interviewing him over some stuff, and he made this statement. I thought this was really great. He just asked this question of the reporter. He said, how did I even become a war hero? He didn't see it that way, and I think the reason he didn't see it that way is where I want to start this morning. See, Max was in the military, and he made a choice to be in the military. Max became a captain as he made choices in the military, and he took more training, and he schooled himself in leadership, and he talked about how to climb the ranks and how to manage a group of men around him and how to safely do these things. And Max did all of that, not knowing what the sacrifice might be. See, we think about sacrifices and we think about some big battlefield action. We think about something that in the moment we're going to make this snap decision because we want to make a big sacrifice in a big way. We want to show up. But the reality is a sacrifice happens way before you get to the battlefield. The sacrifice happens way before you do anything. The sacrifice is a choice that has to happen way before you ever get to the moment where the sacrifice is required. Sacrificial acts don't just happen. They come from decisions that are made in advance of the opportunity. Let me say it again. Sacrificial acts come from decisions that are made in advance of the opportunity. I want you to grab your flyer. We're going to go to 2 Corinthians this morning. This is not a battlefield scenario, but in 2 Corinthians, Paul is writing to the Corinthian church, and he's got a lot of things he's got to say. If you know anything about the Corinthian church, they were pretty messy. There was a whole bunch of stuff going on, stuff that we understand is not appropriate in churches. Like we know God doesn't approve of some of this stuff. And so poor Paul, he's trying to instruct these guys, and he keeps writing letters, and I don't know if they're reading and just ignoring it or what. But in the middle of his instruction, Paul points something out in chapter 8. There's about 5 small verses. It's really a small section. And he starts referencing a sacrificial act, an act of giving. And really in 5 verses, he kind of sets us up with an understanding about what it is to give to God, what it is to steward our resources well. He's talking about a group, the Macedonian church. Now, the Macedonian church is in Greece, so they're across the Mediterranean Ocean, okay? And Palestine is on the other side. The church in Palestine, where Jesus walked, the church in Palestine was experiencing a big famine. There was a drought, they had no food, there was shortage of resources everywhere. The Mediterranean church, the Macedonian church, was very poor too. But in that moment, the Macedonian church heard about their brothers and sisters in Palestine. Let's pick it up in verse 1 of chapter 8, 2 Corinthians. Paul says, "We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia." Paul says, he's talking, he's instructing, he's talking to these Corinthian people, believers, and he stops and he goes, hold on, I want you to know something. I need you to pay attention to something. That something has happened, and he's going to emphasize the idea that not only does God own everything, but how the Macedonian church responds to that. He's going to emphasize that the Macedonian church has encountered this grace of God. That they have begun to understand the grace of God in such a way that it has changed their life. And the decision to give, their decision, the Macedonian church, to give to the work of God begins with this encounter of the grace of God. The Macedonian church decides, those believers decide to give because they'd had an encounter with the grace of God. And that's why they decide to give to this other church in need. It's based on their encounter with God. It's not based on Paul saying, hey, we need you to mail in some money. We need you to fund this project over there. None of that. They heard about the need, it's true, but he says, I want you to pay attention because here's how these guys gave. They are giving because they had encountered the grace of God. There's story after story today, right now, of churches. In fact, my wife's home church, where we grew up, is not doing well. They are running out of money. They are facing the end of possibly that church's life cycle. There's a lot of churches today that the money is running really, really short. Why? Because something is always going to demand our resources. If you're a parent, you know that, right? Like if you're a parent, you got a kid, and every week they need something for school, something else new, tennis shoes. Where anybody have a kid that can last in tennis shoes longer than 6 months? Because my kids growing up, they just couldn't last. I mean, shoes wore out like rapid fire in our house. There's just never a shortage of resources of things that need attention in your life. A month before this whole initiative started, I told you about some of our journey. My wife comes home from the dentist. She needed $8,000 worth of dental work, listen, just to save her teeth. I was a very selfish decision. I like my wife with teeth, so we fixed her teeth, okay? Money wasn't an issue that day. Seriously, it was just, let's get it done, honey. I love you with teeth, all right? All right? But it's always going to be something. I remember thinking, God, what are you doing? We're getting ready to do this initiative. Like, I was hoping to use some of that money. I was going to give it to you, seriously. And all of a sudden, now you want to send it somewhere else. Anybody in the last couple of weeks heard the news, hey, you need a new roof because of the storms that have rolled through the area? What about, it's funny, 2 weeks ago, 2 Sundays ago, some of you won't know this, but I put it together within about a 14-hour window. I had at least 3 families from Journey come up and tell me about the flat tires they'd had. It's never a shortage, a demand on the things in our lives that need attention. So somebody is always needing resources around us in our lives. And if you don't believe that, I'm going to go back to, because my son and I, we have this thing. We like to do the scientific piece of life, right? That's how we're wired. And so I go back. Let's just talk about the second law of thermodynamics for just a second. I'll bring it down if you didn't like school, you didn't like chemistry. Look, the bottom line is science tells us this is reality. That you can put all this energy into a system, and what? It's still going to need more energy. It's still going to keep decaying. It's still going to keep falling apart. Our resources are always going to be in demand, and they're going to get absorbed into things all across life, and none of it's necessarily bad. But the question is, how do we be intentional with using our resources? Paul is interesting. He's talking about these Macedonian Christians, and he's singing their praises, and he's not doing it. Listen, he's not saying that they're better people than the Corinthians. He's not saying they're better Christians. Paul's not praising them because they responded to some TV preacher that says, mail in your money and you're going to get wealthier if you give more. Please don't ever do that. It's not true. It's not biblical, right? Paul's talking to them, and he's saying, look, these guys gave sacrificially simply because they encountered the grace of God. The decision to give to the work of God begins when you encounter the grace of God. So for some of us, I know you're still wrestling with this, and maybe it's because that's why we don't demand that you give around here. We want you to be able to experience the grace of God. We want that to be the motivation. We don't want you sacrificing because you think you're doing it for me or for my family or just to have a building. That's not what sacrifices are built into. Right? That choice has to be made when you encounter the grace of God. And so that's where we start. And that's what Paul points out. Let's go to verse 2 for just a second. He says, keep going, for in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. Remember that phrase, wealth of generosity. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord. It was completely voluntary. We know the Macedonian area was extremely poor. We know from history, okay? It's recorded. When you read that it says, Paul says they were in poverty too, that means extreme poverty, okay? This is dire poverty. These people were in just as bad a shape as the Palestinian church. There was radical poverty. But they encountered the grace of God, and their attitude changed. And I love this. Paul says they gave with joy. That it was part of who they were. Their severe test of affliction was one piece of their life, but what happened? Their abundance of joy overrode all of that. And even in their extreme poverty, they gave. Their encounter with the grace of God changed everything. It changed their outlook. Now, that phrase I said, remember that wealth of their generosity. He's not saying they gave the biggest amount. Understand that. He's not saying that the size of their gift was huge, like the monetary gift was so big that it met all the needs. He's saying their hearts were open, that they were willing to give. They were open-handed with everything. We've been talking about everything at my house, about how do you be open-handed with the things that God has trusted to you, with your savings account. We're trying to be open-handed with even things like our entertainment, our satellite, our TV watching. We're switching providers, trying to cut our bill by 50%. Because as we've been talking through the initiative, it's just one of those things I wrestle with, that can I keep putting money in these places that don't have the greatest impact? How do you be open? I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm telling you what I'm wrestling with. How are you to be open-handed? He says this, write this down. It says, an encounter with the grace of God caused a decision to give to the work of God that set them on a course to produce grace enablement. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Grace enablement. I played with that. In fact, if I had to look that word up to even make sure I wasn't making a word up a while ago, grace enablement. That they became so convinced with an encounter of the grace of God that they were going to give to the work of God, that here's what happened. When they did that, the other people on the other end, the receiving end, started to experience the grace of God too, because of what they had experienced. They become this source of courage because of how they respond to the grace of God in their lives. I remember my grandmother, my mom's mom, we call her Granny, when I would grow up, and Granny would tell me stories of the Great Depression, which, by the way, it sounds a really long time ago, okay? When I say the Great Depression, even I thought, man, does that even resonate? But do you realize we're only 80 years past the end of the Great Depression? So let that sink in for just a second. It really hasn't been that long. But my grandmother, their family was not rich. They were not wealthy. And she would tell me stories over the summers when I would stay with her. And one thing she always taught me was that in her home, no matter how little they had, if somebody came to the back door, because that was the tradition in the day, that if you were hungry and you were traveling through, you might stop into the back door of a home, knock, and see if anybody, I'm sure the kitchens were really close to that back door, if anybody there might offer you some food. My grandmother used to tell me, she'd say, no matter how little we have, we never turned away anybody who asked for food. When you have that encounter with the grace of God and it starts to change your perspective, then you know what? When you start to act on that, you now begin to enable the ability of God's grace to be manifested in other people's lives. That's what we're shooting for, right? That's the reality we want to chase down, Journey, is that our perspective becomes so changed that this idea of sacrifice, it's just a choice we've already made. And as we begin to live into it, we will see the grace of God extended to other people's lives in a way that maybe they weren't even ready for at that time, in that moment. Let's keep going, verse 4. Paul continues, he says, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. I love this. I have never seen this. Has anybody ever shown up to church one Sunday and you see somebody up front and they're begging to write a big check to the church? Anybody ever seen that? Raise your hand, go ahead. Anybody want to beg today? These guys, yeah, thank you. These guys are begging Paul. We want to give. Like we got to give. You can't leave us out of this. Paul's probably looking at them going, guys, you're as poor as they are. You got your own problems. And they're begging him, Paul, we want to participate. God's blessed us. We can find something to give. Verse 5. And this, not as we expected. Paul says, we didn't expect them. We really didn't even anticipate they were going to give. But they gave themselves, watch this, first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. An encounter with the grace of God demands we actively engage our faith daily. An encounter with the grace of God demands that we actively engage our faith daily. Paul says they had encountered the grace of God, and by doing that, they all of a sudden had to restructure how they live their lives. what they did with their resources, even in their extreme poverty, where they still found joy, they wanted to give. But listen to me, it's a decision. It's a decision. It's a decision that then requires some discipline. A couple of weeks ago, we started this little thing where we called it the Generosity Project. We gave you, Generosity Challenge, we gave you $5. And we sent you out. Why? Because we want you to practice the discipline of giving, of when you've got something in your hands, saying to God, I've got something, and I know it's yours, so specifically, what would you have me do with it, right? We want you to learn that discipline with everything you have in your life. But we did that with just $5. And I told you, I know it's going to sound like $5 is not a lot, but the stories have been great just coming in, and they're still coming in, of how you're taking that $5 and making a difference in somebody's life. I got a great email from Amanda this week, and it's too long to read, but I'll just try to hit the highlights. You can ask her about the story later if you know Amanda, but she went to Walmart, as we all do in this area. She went to Walmart and has just been praying about that, and at some point sensed God telling her to talk to one of the employees. And so she did, but like me, you do this, you kind of question, what am I supposed to do? What really, God, am I supposed to, why would I talk to this person? What does that even mean? She talked and then even walked away, I think, once or twice, and kept feeling God's tug to pull her back and keep talking to this guy. This guy is an immigrant from Africa whose marriage has fallen apart. He's here legally, but his life is falling apart. And he's afraid now of being evicted because he doesn't have enough money. Now, her $5 didn't solve his problem. But do you know what he asked her? I love this. I wrote it in my notes. He said, I want to know if God hears my cries. He wanted assurance. He needed somebody to talk to more than he needed $5 or $100 that day, probably. And there she was, being obedient. $5 did that. It causes us to just ask, what do I do? It's a decision, right? When you encounter the grace of God and you know you got to do something, then you just have to start paying attention. And that's all we're asking you to do. Here, write this down. Big idea. This sacrifice that we're talking about is a choice. It is not an obligation. You are not obliged. You're not being ordered to do anything. I'm appealing to you. And not as somebody who's going to just receive all of this. I'm appealing to you as your pastor, saying, this is the same thing I do every day too as well. I have to wrestle with God in these moments and ask myself, have I encountered the grace of God? And if so, how is it changing my life on a daily basis? What is next? What's next? What's next for you? Have you encountered the grace of God? What does it look like in your life? Are you surrendering more and more? Are every day when you walk with Him, are you beginning to understand? Are you beginning to hear Him? Are you beginning to sense when He tells you, hey, talk to that person, or just say hi to that person, or put your arm around this person, or give this person $5? Are you responding? As you respond to that grace of God, you know what's going to happen? You're going to start to hear more and more what He wants of you. And listen to me. When I say that, I'm not saying that you're going to get all the answers to your life that you want, okay? This is not about you, and it's not about me. This is about the people around us that need to know the grace of God. And when you encounter the grace of God, you start to respond. You make a choice. You decide you're going to live your life in a sacrificial way. You know what's going to happen? You're going to enable the grace of God in other people's lives, and that is going to be when you get excited about your own faith even more. When you see God working that way. Where is God leading you? Where is He leading you to some kind of sacrificial, extravagant, above and beyond expression in your life? I believe this Journey. I believe God has great things for Journey in the next couple of years. I'm excited about it. I can't believe how long it took us to get to this point, but I also am amazed at where we are right now. I also believe that Journey is not the kind of church that invites people. Listen to me. We're not the kind of church that we want to invite people to experience the grace of God by giving, right? That you have to give to experience the grace of God. That's not biblical, and it's not who we want to be. But we do want to be the kind of church that invites people to begin to think sacrificially about their lives because they've encountered the grace of God. that we will model it, that we begin to think sacrificially just about every area of our life because we've encountered the grace of God. And because we're willing to walk with him. And because we're willing to respond and make that decision in advance. If we do that, big things will happen. Big things will happen. So that's the invitation. Respond to the grace of God that you've encountered. And be ready to decide in advance. Because when the time comes for the sacrifice, you will have already had to have made your decision. We don't make those battlefield calls in that moment. What we do is we make them way in advance. And then when we get there, we're ready. We're ready for the sacrifice. Let me pray for us.